Hello everyone, welcome to Mr. Noctory. Today we will go to the commoners in the city of Babylon with an urban perspective. Smelly butcher stalls, fabric shops with threads hanging loose, laws, markets, and the fate of those who are not allowed to make mistakes, dusty streets, hot camels dropping dung everywhere people cram together, class. The rich have fabric, have servants, you have hunger, and a burn mark. You cannot bargain because you have no standing to demand. The law leaves no room for please go easy, only stones clearly carved with punishments. Trust is not a luxury, it is a survival mechanism. Before we begin, if you truly find this a pleasant place to take shelter late at night, please like and subscribe, but only if you truly want to. No pressure like the law in the old tavern. Only if you need a quiet place. And you know what I love most? It's looking at the comments, seeing where you're from and what time it is. Whether it's New York or Norway, 1 in the morning or 5 in the morning, you're still here and I see you. Now turn off the lights. Turn on a little fan if you have one. Not because it's hot, but for that soft buzzing sound. No dreams, no visions, just the smell of earth and back pain. You open your eyes not because you've had enough sleep, but because it's so hot your eyelids can't stay shut anymore. The room has no windows, no door, just a hole in the mud wall, big enough for the neighbor's rooster to sneak its noise in, and big enough for flies to treat it like a highway straight into your nose. You don't sleep on a bed. Babylon doesn't spare beds for commoners. You sleep on a rotted reed mat laid on ground harder than the hearts of northern gods. Your back doesn't hurt. Your back is mourning. Each vertebra is a small groan, like a farewell letter to the rest of your body. The first smell of the day isn't coffee. There's no coffee here, only the smell of damp earth. From the house foundation that never dried from kitchen ash, lingering since last month, and something very distinct. Donkey dung fermenting in the sun. If you thought soft music would wake you, then no. You're woken by a wife yelling at her kids, a child banging on a pot and a chicken, not crowing, but coughing like it's smoked hookah for 10 years. You sit up, your hair matted like a clump of weeds after the flood season. Pain doesn't spread. It crashes from neck to spine, from shoulder to back. You feel like last night instead of resting you fought a bull and lost. Sunlight slips into the house through a wall crack, shining straight onto the chipped clay pot, waiting to be boiled. The morning sounds aren't lullabies, they're chaos like a market brawl. The neighbor's knife hitting the wooden cutting board, charcoal crackling like it's whispering about unpaid debts. Far away is the clanking of a cowbell, not poetic, but a reminder that today you still can't afford to buy back your old sandals. The air is thick with smells, stove ash. Yesterday's sweat stuck to your shirt and the scent of unbathed humans. Babylon doesn't know deodorant, only the habit of living with the smell. You take a breath and instantly regret it. That's the first mistake of the day, but not the last. You step off the mat, your foot landing on something soft, maybe a rag, maybe a mouse too tired to flee. No one asks what you plan to do today, because you don't plan, you just must. If you don't do it, there's nothing to eat, and if you don't eat, you die, and Babylon has no place to bury nameless dead. They'll take you to the Euphrates River and kick you off like a broken sandal. On the mud wall is an old phrase written in charcoal, "May the god ear bless." No one really believes it works, But people keep it there, like folks today keep a Buddha image in their taxi, not out of faith, but in case the gods happen to glance by. You sigh not because you're sad, but because you have to practice breathing before going outside, where dust and insults can choke you any moment. You tie up your torn shirt, use your hair tie as a belt. You haven't brushed your teeth, there's no toothbrush. You haven't washed your face, the water is for cooking only. You step outside Babylon's heat, feels like the palm of God Marduk when he's angry. You say softly, almost like a whisper, another day, and you begin to walk. Underfoot is dust and sand, above is the sun. Ahead is Babylon, the greatest city in the world, unless you live in it. If someone asked, what does your house look like? You would say, like a rat's nest, but with less straw and more debt. Your house has no door, only a tattered burlap cloth, once a grain sack now hung up by a fishbone and a large thorn. Whenever the wind rises, it doesn't shield, it taunts. It flaps wildly, as if calling the entire market to come see your poverty-stricken interior. The walls are coated with clay, the kind dug from the riverbank during dry season, mixed with kitchen ash and a bit of tears. Tears because while mixing, you knew it would crack, not because you did it wrong, but because it's Babylon clay. Everything here cracks except the bills. In a corner of the house is a broken-mouthed ceramic jar now used for water. Every morning you look at your reflection in it. The surface isn't smooth, so you always see yourself distorted, warped, but that's easier to accept than seeing the real you. Every night, when Babylon sleeps, if it truly sleeps, you curl up in an old piece of cloth. The cloth isn't warm, just not cold. You think about things called dreams, but you've never dreamed because the sleep of the commoner isn't deep enough to reach dreams. You once wished for a door not to stop thieves, but to stop life. To block the neighbors arguing over a broken bowl. To block the creditor's voice asking, "When will you pay?" with a tone soft as a blade. To block your own sighs each time you remember something that used to be hope. Once, you stacked broken bricks to block the entrance, pretending it was a door. 3 days later, a neighbor took them to prop up his birdcage. That's Babylon. If it's not nailed down, it's not yours. You know how your doorless house differs from a bureaucrat's house? Not thicker walls, but someone to guard it. In Babylon, power doesn't lie in the number of doors, but in who can enter your house without you daring to stop them. And even if it's nailed down, it still might not be yours. Inside the house besides you is a cat. There's a small corner where a stone is placed said to ward off evil. No one's sure what it actually does, but everyone has one. In Babylon, you don't dare believe in miracles, but you fear living without them even more. No one knows where the stone came from. Maybe it also had no door. It sits there looking at you with eyes as if it was once a cursed prince, now forced to live with laborers. You don't talk to anyone in the house because there's no one to talk to. The house has only you, your shadow and old questions stuck to the ceiling like cobwebs. Is this all there is? Will tomorrow be any different than yesterday? If there were a door, would I close it or open it and run? But questions are never answered. They just come back every night like mosquitoes. Light bite, persistent itch, not deadly, but enough to steal sleep. And then, at some point, you stop asking. You just stay awake, then tired, then lie down, turn your face to the mud wall, listening to your heartbeat like a small drum in the desert. Not to call anyone, just to know you haven't turned into dust yet. Tomorrow, the cloth will still flap, the wind will still blow in, the light will still seep through the cracks. You'll still get up, scratch your head, tie your torn shirt, and step out of the house without a door. No one sees you off, no one greets you, no one remembers if you left or returned. Only Babylon silently watching you move forward, as if you were just another piece in its crumbling wall. Breakfast in Babylon isn't a meal. It's a reminder you're still alive. You don't eat because you're hungry. You eat because if you don't chew something, your mouth might open and say things it shouldn't. And in Babylon, saying the wrong thing can make you lose your head faster than you lose sleep. This morning, there's barley porridge, not the good kind like in the priest's house. Your porridge is as thin as foot-washing water with a wilted sprig of greens on top, like a sarcastic garnish sprinkled there on purpose. You sit and eat in silence, not out of grace, but because poverty has no flavor. Your wooden bowl is chipped every time you lift it. You have to angle it just right, so it doesn't spill on your hand. Hot but not warm bitter, but without any real taste. The neighbor sits across the yard sucking on an onion peel. No one asks anyone anything because to ask is to borrow, and no one wants to lend sorrow. There's a shout from the street. 2 dried fish for 1 silver ring. But don't think it's just the shouts you hear in Babylon. There are markets that never make it onto the clay tablets, where people trade diarrhea medicine for secrets, or the wigs of corpses for a lunch in the royal courtyard. Because when you're hungry, you'll see that loyalty can be sold, thread by thread. You laugh in Babylon, silver is money, fish is food, and sometimes food is more important than money. You remember seeing a man yesterday bite through his own necklace to trade it for bread. His gums bled, but he kept chewing. In Babylon, that's how you say, "I'm not dying today." On the other side of the city, where you'll never be allowed to go, breakfast doesn't include porridge. They eat roasted goat barley bread, drink malted beer from golden cups, and they call it a light meal. In Babylon, the rich don't eat to live. They eat to remind themselves. They're not like you. You look at the porridge, then your hand, trembling slightly because last night's sleep wasn't enough. Then you keep eating like the bowl is the only reason you're still here. No one gives thanks, no one prays, because when you've eaten with misery long enough, you stop seeing gods at the table. There's only your shadow bent low gnawing on what's left. This is the breakfast of the futureless, no plans, no dreams, no fried eggs. Just thin porridge, a few coughs, and the hope that today isn't worse than yesterday. Food in Babylon is distributed by list, but the list is held by the one who writes on clay, and his hand tends to shake, especially when you have nothing to offer up front. Sometimes you're handed porridge, sometimes you're handed a reason why there isn't any today. You step out of your house, meaning you pull the ragged cloth aside and tell yourself, this is a door. Outside is the street, not the kind of quaint cobblestone lane painted in pretty pictures. This is Babylon, where in one step you can land on a snakegoat, droppings and misinformation. Shouting voices, squawking chickens, the crash of pottery. No one hears anyone, no one stops. Babylon's streets have no red lights. Only louder voices win. Whoever shouts louder is more right. Whoever shouts longer has more power, and those who stay silent lose their spot. You squeeze through a crowd arguing about the price of eggs, something clearly none of them can afford. An old woman curses in a mix of old Akkadian and new Sumerian. A young man snaps back with a voice full of market dust and sweat from last week. In Babylon, arguments don't need to be right, just persistent and vicious. A guard walks past, leather whip in hand. He says nothing, just stares. But that stare alone scatters the crowd like husks, because Babylonian law doesn't need many lines. The whip is always right. You stop at a stall selling clay amulets. The vendor says, if you place one under your pillow, it'll let you dream of lost loved ones. Farther along, by the gate stands a man called the news shouter. That's how Babylon spreads the news each morning, by yelling. No paper, no letters, just breath and the raw sound from deep in the throat. Morning shouters have 3 settings: good news, Gins, steady voice, bad news, cracked voice, forbidden news. Shout and run. In Babylon, you don't need to know what happened. You just need to hear who shouted first. You ask what happens if you don't dream. The vendor answers, then they don't want to see you. You don't buy it, not because you don't believe, but because you're afraid. They really don't want to see you. A child is being dragged through the street. Its eyes are dry, but its hand still clutches an old piece of bread. You want to look away, but it's too late. The whip slices the air like a warning. Don't interfere if you have no status. A fortune teller shouts, the stars are misaligned today. Someone next to him yells louder, the price of fish is worse. Then the entire street erupts in argument about fish. You think of your morning porridge and realize sometimes an empty stomach is also a law. In the eastern corner, there's a mud wall called the Justice Board, where people post complaints, not on paper, but on wet clay. Anyone with a grievance, the cheated, the robbed, the wronged, comes here to carve their plea, but only the short ones that don't mention officials or insult fish prices get to stay. The offensive ones, by morning washed off by rain or scraped away by guards. In Babylon, justice exists, but it's as thin as clay that hasn't dried. In Babylon, faith doesn't whisper, it shouts, it dances. It's sold by weight in the market, and if you have money, it's yours. But if you don't, all you hear is the shouting, and you call that the street. If Babylon had a heart, it wouldn't beat to breath but to shouting. You walk into the market with an empty cloth pouch and a heart full of hope. 5 steps in, you hear the first yell, fresh fish, just pulled from Enki's sacred canal. But the smell is more like fish that has reincarnated. Babylon's market wasn't planned. It grew with every curse word. A butcher's stall next to a fortune teller's beside a boy selling scraps of clay. Sellers sit on cracked stone stools. Buyers stand in the sun as if posture already decided power. You try asking the price of a bronze bracelet. The seller doesn't look at you. He looks behind you, as if waiting for someone who looks more worthy. In Babylon, there's no such thing as fixed price. Only the price you seem worth yelling at. An old woman is selling lightning charms a rock with a crudely drawn thunderbolt. Next to her is a smaller stall offering jars of mud claimed to be from where god Marduk once stepped. Each jar fits in your palm, but costs twice a sack of grain. You ask if everyone collects mud from there, will there be enough? The seller shrugs. God walked more than you think. You ask, How do you know it works? She says, I've held it for 30 years, haven't been struck by lightning yet. You're not sure whether to believe or walk away quickly. There's a stall that sells curses, not a joke. Some merchants even rent curses to post on rival booths. Curses written in unreadable symbols, but with very clear drawings. Of diarrhea. You pick a target, describe the situation, pay extra if you want diarrhea to hit at the hour of worship. A clay amulet will be inscribed in Sumerian, a language even fortune tellers guess at. If you don't understand, they'll offer to translate for an extra fee. You're not sure if you've just had your fate told or been scammed with an ancient sigh. In Babylon, sometimes people buy curses just to feel they still have power. You see a fat man bargaining for a lion mask, not to wear to a festival, but to wear when collecting taxes. He says, my real face doesn't scare the people. You're not sure if he's a garden official or just someone who enjoys cosplaying as a tyrant. All you know is the seller bows very low. At the end of the market is the discard zone, things no one wants to sell, but no one wants to pick up either. You find a shard of broken bowl engraved with a stranger's name, a pair of mismatched shoes, and a charm half erased leaving just 3 words. Forgive this time. You take it home, tuck it under your pillow, not to pray to gods, but to remind yourself. Next time, don't enter the market with hope. In Babylon, shopping isn't to get what you need. It's to learn your true worth in other people's eyes. And it's usually less than a rotten fish. Babylon wakes to the sound of bamboo brooms sweeping temple courtyards and wooden mallets pounding clay molds. No alarm clocks, just hunger and fear of being beaten if you're late. You step out before dawn. Sunrise hasn't yet touched the Euphrates, but the craftsmen have already soaked their shoulders with sweat and dust. No one asks you, what do you want to do today? You're only asked, can you still stand? In Babylon, work is a second religion, but without the promise of salvation. You might be a brickmaker, a stone cutter, a water carrier, or a ceremonial cart puller. No one asks, what did you major in? They just need your back, and whether it still holds up. Brickmaking is common recipe. Clay, rotted straw water, and groaning. They mix it by foot, pour it into wooden molds, leave it to dry under a sun as hot as a curse. If the brick cracks, you owe a day's wage if it's stolen. You owe the whole season, and if you collapse halfway, no one stops. Brickmakers die often enough. There's a cemetery section just for them. They call it the land of flawed firing. Some dream of being scribes sitting under a tree, writing cuneiform on clay tablets. But to be chosen, you need to know 3,000 symbols and endure being smacked on the head with old tablets when you mess up. Official documents often blur between ritual poems and criminal laws. Some days you copy a sentence about sentencing, then get told to add a blessing to the gods. Being a scribe in Babylon isn't for the love of ink, it's to take blame. If you spell the king's name wrong, if you miss a stroke in Hammurabi's name, they won't ask if you're tired. They'll ask how many lashes you'd like. Misspelling the king is blasphemy. Punishment is usually whipping or being banned from touching clay for a whole festival season. You work pulling ceremonial carts. The cart is heavier than you, the idol on it, heavier than the cart. You pull with rope with your back and with silent prayers. Slip once the idol falls. You don't just lose your job, you lose the right to be called by name. Temple guards work in shifts, but changing shifts doesn't mean rest. It just means you get to yell at others instead of being yelled at. You stand for hours wearing painted leather armor under a sun that speaks in threats. And if someone crosses the line, you hit no questions asked. Some jobs don't have names like cleaning sacrificial pens, tending the fire pit, recording lawsuits no one reads, but still must be written. And those called healers who don't actually heal. They stand beside the sick, burn incense, chant spells, and rub sesame oil on the forehead, not to cure, but so the gods won't notice. In Babylon, healing means calming the divine. The patient is told, don't cough too loud, you might disturb the ritual. In Babylon, you're not someone, you're the person held responsible if things go wrong. By evening, you drag yourself home back bleeding from the pulling rope hands, wrinkled from wet bricks, and your mind as blurred as the fading marks on clay. You have no time card, just a scar on your shoulder as your wage. And tomorrow, you'll get up again, not because you love your job, but because hunger hurts more than the beatings. Babylon had pyramids, but not for burying the dead, for burying you, alive, in layers of rank. At the top of the pyramid was the king, the only one who didn't have to listen to anyone except the gods, and sometimes his own dreams. Below the king were the priests. Those who spoke for the gods wore gold-embroidered robes and spoke a language no one dared say was wrong. Next came nobles and scribes, the class that could read tax and decide who should disappear. Below them were merchants, the ones who could count and knew how to keep people in debt for 3 generations. Then came farmers who carried the economy on their backs and were forgotten after each harvest. And below that was you. You didn't fall here through failure. You were born on this level, like your father and his father before him. In Babylon, status wasn't something you earned but a gift no one gave you unless your lineage was carved on clay tablets. If your father was a slave, your real name wasn't written on tax records, just property of holder, number 142. You had no land, no family tree, no sponsor in court. Your name wasn't on any clay tablet displayed during the harvest festival. The list of citizens qualified to receive divine grain. You lived in the dirt quarter south of the canal, where the smell of sewage overpowered even the smell of people. That place didn't have a name on any official map. It was referred to by gestures, not writing. No one recorded who lived there because they weren't among those worth recording. Each day you brought goods to the market only to sell them for less than someone whose father worked in the grain storehouse. You saw a man who spoke poorly sitting comfortably in the scribe's office. You saw someone who once owed you, now a guard with the right to search your basket any time. You weren't angry, you just learned to bow. In Babylon, the law knew your place in the ladder. If you hit a noble, you lost a hand. If a noble hit you, you lost the right to complain. If you accidentally brushed their robe, it was offending the divine representative. If they slapped you in the market, it was a necessary warning to the impolite. If you stole, your name was hung in the market. If you were robbed, you were asked, why didn't you guard better? If no one vouched for you, you couldn't sue. If you couldn't read, you couldn't understand the verdict. You didn't resent, you just feared. One day you'd wander into the noble quarter by mistake and never return, because you didn't have a permit to exist there. You weren't the poorest, but you were the only one not recognized as existing. And so, you lived between two layers belonging nowhere. Above you were the heels of the powerful, below you was mud, the only thing loyal to gravity. You didn't dream of being king. You just hoped to one day stand on solid ground without being reminded. You're standing on borrowed space. And if you tried to rise, act like someone of status, speak differently, wear a cleaner shirt, it wasn't called effort. You'd be accused of impersonating a higher class. In Babylon, trying to escape your station was a confession of guilt. Early morning you walk through the central square. At the center stands a black stone pillar, big as a threat given form. On it, wedge-shaped writing, sharp, pointed, cold, and unquestionable. It's not a monument. It's a list of what you'll be punished for if you forget who you are in this society. Its name is Hammurabi's Code. And no, it wasn't written for you to live peacefully. It was carved so everyone knew whose head would roll first if something went wrong. You hear an old woman whisper to her grandchild, "Remember, if you knock down someone's house, you must rebuild it, even if it's just one brick. But if you're the builder and the house collapses, you stake your life to replace the roof. There is no clause for just a technical error. You step closer, raise your eyes to read each line, one line deep and clear, like it was carved with a knife, not a chisel. If one gives false testimony and causes harm to an innocent, they shall suffer the same punishment as the one wrongly accused." You shiver because you remember yesterday someone was beaten for theft just on the word of a drunk man. And if tomorrow morning that man is dragged to the pillar, the law won't ask how you were feeling that day. It only asks, did you lie? Not to educate, just to make sure you didn't mess up again yesterday. If a husband suspects his wife of infidelity, he can throw her in the river as long as the water god agrees. No proof needed, no testimony. Just make sure the current doesn't return the body. You don't dare stare too long. Each law is a short nightmare, but the punishments last a lifetime. A girl beside you whispers, "I cracked the master's pottery." What do you think the law says? Then she tells of her sister returned to her parents after the groom backed out of marriage. The law made her family repay all the bride price, even though it was the groom who changed his mind. You just sigh. In Babylon, love isn't in the law only property. If the man changes his mind, the law protects the dowry. If the woman does, the law protects the groom's family's honor. You say nothing because you remember clause 117. If a slave damages the master's property, they repay with their body. The law doesn't care if it was an accident. The law doesn't need your love, it just needs your fear. In Babylon, justice doesn't lie in people's hearts, it lies in stone. Hard cold, no room for tears, no line for leniency if first offense. You once thought justice was a balance, but here justice is a hammer. And you're what's being weighed, not the one holding the scale. If you take someone's eye, you lose yours. If you take someone's ear, you lose yours, but only if both are equal in rank. If you're common and they're noble, then punishment becomes money. Or an apology so formal it makes you feel smaller. Justice is stone, but even stone has social class. The law says if you steal bread, you lose your hand. But if a noble steals your land, the law says submit your complaint to the priest. If you have a witness, can read and survive the famine. What do you have? Only dry eyes because crying is useless. The stone pillar doesn't listen. You stand there a while, then bow and walk on. not because you've memorized all 282 laws, but because you understand they weren't written for you to understand. They were written so you'd never dare forget. You don't know what you did wrong. You just know that this morning the guards knocked, not to say good morning. There's no summons, no explanation, just one sentence. Someone said you took something that wasn't yours. And just like that, you become the defendant. The courtroom is not what you imagined. It's in the backyard of the Temple of Marduk, where people offer sacrifices, slaughter sheep, and try people. There's no judge's bench, just a wooden platform and pairs of eyes. You try to speak, but the law doesn't ask you to speak. The law asks you to prove what you didn't do. Sitting across from you is the accuser, a merchant with braided beard and gold bracelets, and the one presiding wears a white robe, a conical wool hat. A priest who doesn't smile, doesn't ask, doesn't answer. You've heard he once ruled on a theft case based only on a divine dream omen. Babylonian law doesn't just ask for documents. It asks for divine trust through the priest's words. He doesn't look at you. He only looks at the priest reading old lines on a clay tablet. And if you wonder what your testimony is worth, sorry, the answer is less than his gold bracelet. In Babylon, the words of a salt merchant weigh more than the oath of a poor potter. You may be innocent, but if the one accusing you wears finer cloth, justice will lean toward the better scent. The defendant brings no witness, no receipt, no clay tablet bearing an oath. You've heard of the thing called oath before the god statue. A ritual to prove your innocence if you have enough to hire a scribe, a witness, and can read the proper oath aloud. But you can't read, and your pockets aren't deep enough to pay for a full ritual with incense and official witnesses. So you don't qualify to be allowed to tell the truth. Not enough gold to swear before the god statue. The priest nods. The guards drag you away, not to continue the trial, but to execute it. You've heard rumors there's one way out. If you agree to jump in the river, not everyone gets to stand in court, but everyone might be given the chance to drown. It's called the ordeal of the river god. If you float, you're innocent because the water god showed mercy. If you sink, that's fine too, because justice remains silent. If you survive, the god has cleared your name. If you die, no one questions it. You're given a cup of water not to drink, but to rinse your mouth before dying. The god likes cleanliness. You look around, no mother, no one crying, because everyone is afraid of being emotionally affiliated. In Babylon, loving the wrong person is an emotional crime. You step toward the river. There's no drum roll, no soundtrack, just the sound of water. You jump, not to prove anything, but because you have nothing left to lose. The next morning, a child finds your belt. They don't know your name and no one mentions you again. You stood in the wrong place and lost your whole life. There's no hourglass flipping to signal break time, just the shadow of the ziggurat starting to slide across your face. You know it's time to sit, because the law doesn't give you rest, but it gives your boss the right to punish you if you rest too long. In the Hammurabi Code, there's no line about labor stopping when the sun is at its peak. But there is a law about punishment for lack of diligence, meaning if you collapse from heat stroke, it's your fault if you rest too long. That's your crime. In Babylon, exhaustion isn't an excuse, it's a clay-inscribed offense. Not because they let you rest, but because if you don't, you'll collapse. And if you collapse, they'll call you lazy. You find a patch of stone wall no one else has claimed. Below, hot dust above sunlight pours like molten asphalt from the sky. A kid selling dates runs by carrying a basket barefoot like the soul of the god of poverty. He doesn't look at you, but you hear him call out, "Dried dates, now with half the water of tears." The man next to you gnaws on a piece of bread as dry as the Hammurabi Code. Crisp, hard, and beyond argument. You ask if he has water. He doesn't answer. He swallows. That swallow sounds like the sun's mockery. Up above, slave traders sit under the temple awning, chewing grapes and chatting about the price of young flesh. You're counting your heartbeats before the sun pierces the only sliver of shade you have. In Babylon, shade isn't for everyone. It's rationed by class, like taxes, like names, like the right to wear a real belt. The rich sit under awnings with servants fanning. The merchant class shares the pillar's shade. And you, the poor, must shoulder your way under shade left behind by others. Even the shadow of a passing man is something you have to fight for with your eyes. Its power, its hierarchy, its privilege. Like gold, like surnames, like breathing without asking. A young potter crawls out of the kiln face flushed red. He asks if anyone has bread. No one answers, because there's less bread than mouths, and if you have bread, you'd be a fool to say so. You remember your mother once said, "You can be poor, but don't sit outside at noon under Babylon sky." And now you know that was a prophecy, not advice. You're thirsty. Your throat is raw, like it's been carved with fingernails. You wonder, if I steal that old man's water jar while he sleeps, will anyone accuse me? And then you remember you don't need to be accused. Someone just has to say they think you thought about it. And you sit still again, thirsty, silent, under a column's shadow that everyone thinks you don't deserve. You don't ask for water. You don't ask for bread. You only want one thing, a shadow without stairs. You sit there like a faded ink mark under ancient sunlight. Deep within the inner city, there's a tiled courtyard called the King's Shadow. That place is shaded all day not by walls, but by structure built to block the sun eternally. They say that's where Shamash, the sun god, bows to royal power. Only two kinds of people may step there, the king, and those about to be executed. If you happen to rest under that shadow, it means you've committed treason and pronounced your own sentence. No one asks your name. No one asks when your break ends. No one asks what you need, and you don't ask anymore. You just wait for the sun to move. The sky doesn't collapse with trumpets, but with silence. You lie curled up on a rooftop covered in clay, face up to the sky, and see nothing, because there are no stars, only dust, and that sickly yellow glow that looks like it's been squeezed from old sheep fat. A dog howls at the corner wall, as if it too knows it shouldn't be living here. Someone next to you coughs dryly. Another turns over. Someone breathes hard, not to breathe, but to let others know they're still alive. The night isn't cool, it's just less hot. Like when you've had a fever all day and wake up with a slightly lower body temp, but still sick. You don't ask anymore. You don't think about bread, water, or shade. You just want to sleep, without dreaming. Because in Babylon, dreams are for the well-fed. Sleep, like food, is ranked. Those with names, titles, noble blood, sleep on soft wool cushions under ceilings hung with incense. Those with money, sleep in lofts with reed roofs and silent servants fanning the mosquitoes. And you sleep on the clay roof beside the smell of dried urine, with a dream you aren't allowed to remember the next morning. You look up at the sky not to pray, but to wait for the gods to answer. At Esagila, the holiest temple for the god Marduk, prayers are pre-written on clay tablets. The priests read them at fixed hours with tones as solemn as if speaking to a king, who isn't available to respond. Your name isn't on that tablet, and what you say no one repeats, because in Babylon even prayer needs access rights. They don't answer, not because they don't hear, but because they're not obliged to. Once your mother said, the god Marduk made the world from the flesh of Tiamat, a monster of chaos, which means from the beginning, everything started with killing someone, so you could sleep in peace. So then, who are you to ask for peace? You lie there like a prayer sent out with no address. Elsewhere on a rooftop, a small oil lamp flares, not because someone's reading, but because they're afraid their soul might leak in the dark. Babylonians believe that if you sleep without light, Ereshkigal, goddess of the underworld, will sneak into your dreams and take you down. But oil is expensive. Sheep, fat is rare, and faith has become something to ration. You remember the smell of your own sweat. The bricks held heat all day but now feel ice cold, like they're sulking because you're too poor to build extra insulation. A crack in the wall points straight at the sky like a doorway to nowhere. Old folks in Babylon say, if night wind passes through that crack and hits your neck, your soul will wake and leave. So the poor learn to sleep quietly. No turning, no dreaming, no loud breathing. The smell of roasted meat from the market. The smell of burnt oil mixed with worn human skin. The scent of a city that never bathes. And then you hear thunder from afar, not from rain, but from someone screaming, as if trying to remind the gods they're still alive. You don't scream with them because you know screaming won't help. The gods hear, they just don't answer. You close your eyes not to dream, but to stop seeing. They died no drums, no trumpets, no priest, no perfumed oil, no one standing guard over their souls, just flies. You once saw someone disappear from the street, and no one asked. You once heard a moan from the neighbor's house, and then silence. You once walked past an alley that smelled strange, and kept going, because in Babylon, the poor didn't have the right to die officially. Every morning, guards collected the nameless corpses from the southern part of the city, where the ground was soft and the smell was damp. No one recorded it. No one lit a lamp. No one remembered. Only stray cats knew which areas had fresh meat. You asked, so who were they? They answered, don't know, could have been a potter, a hired hand, a child. Then they added, could have also been a lazy man, a sinner, or simply not important enough to remember. In Babylon, memory was a form of currency. The wealthy had gravestones made of stone, carved so deep the rain couldn't wash it away. Their funerals were events. Someone washed the body with perfumed oil imported from Assyria. Someone lit lamps for 7 days and 7 nights so the soul wouldn't get lost. Their names were written on clay tablets and sent to the temple of Esagila, where memories of the worthy were stored. In some cases, their tombs were sealed with spells, as a way to lock the door forever, keeping out vengeful spirits or gossip from the other side. The poor had a few remembered words in someone's head, if they were lucky, But memory is also poor. And when the one who remembered them died too, they disappeared a second time. You've been told about sinners who weren't buried, not because they were hated, but because they were too cheap to hate. Some were taken away at night, hung on wooden poles outside Babylon, not as a warning, but to save on burial land. At the North Gate, people called it the field of rejected souls. Every morning guards didn't look, they just counted shadows. No hand washing, no perfumed oil, no earth and no path to the underworld. Not worth punishing, no one to forgive. And because of that, no one to send them off. The god Nergal, the one who guards the gates of the underworld, didn't greet them. No names in the prayer rites, no one to call. They weren't allowed to enter death completely. They drifted between dirt and broken dreams, led by night winds along the Babylonian walls. No one hears them, but every night there's a soft knock from the dark. You once saw an old brick in a wall scratched like someone had tried to carve their name and gave up. You don't know their name, don't know who they were. Just know that hand once tried not to vanish into dust. That's when you understand. It's not death that's terrifying. It's disappearing without anyone noticing. They once lived, once breathed, once laughed, once bled, and then were gone. Not because they did wrong, but because they had nothing to leave behind. No name, no stone, no one to remember. Only one thing remains. You, reading this, and for a brief moment, you remembered them. And sometimes, that is the only thing left to call eternal. If you ever thought luxury meant bubble baths or chilled champagne, then ancient Rome will make you redefine it. Because for a wealthy Roman noble, luxury wasn't just about living well. It was a never-ending performance, where every wall, every nod from a slave, every wine cup, had to declare one's status. Imagine you're a guest at a party thrown by Gaius, the richest senator in the Aventine district. The villa doors open not by human hands, but by a chain of slaves dressed in white tunics, each holding a corner of a red silk cord. If you're an equity, a member of the prestigious knightly class, you'll be led inside through a marble-laid hallway. If you're just a lucky commoner invited in, you might be held back at the colonnade outside the atrium, standing under sunlight pouring from above, with no one bothering to ask your name. From the moment you enter, the social hierarchy lays itself bare. No guards, no signage required. Just the way people bow, or don't. The carpet under your feet isn't just fabric. It's purple dyed wool from Tyre, more expensive than gold. On the walls are frescoes, not of landscapes, but of the host. Conquering slaves, killing wild beasts, placing laurel wreaths on his own head. In Pompeii and Herculaneum, aristocratic villas were filled wall to wall with these kinds of paintings, not to beautify, but to remind everyone who was the strongest in the room, even after he died. Some frescoes even depicted orgies, collective rites with gods all painted with emotionless faces, as if pleasure itself had become a religious ceremony. This was no longer decoration. This was an ideology smeared onto walls. I am allowed to do everything because I am a free and rich Roman. The space you're standing in is called the atrium, the central hall of a domus-style villa where light pours straight from an open ceiling. Further back is the peristyle, a garden surrounded by columns filled with fragrant flowers and marble busts where noble women liked to stroll in silence. The walls are painted using the red Pompeii technique. Layers of plaster and powdered stone mixed with brilliant red iron oxide. This isn't just a residence, it's a statement of status. I am so wealthy, even my space must tell my story. As you walk further in, you hear running water, not from a faucet, but from a fountain shaped like Bacchus, riding a leopard pouring sweet grape wine into a silver basin. You haven't even sat down, but you already know your status is lower than the table itself. Because here, everything has a rank, from wine cups to the way one breathes. Servants stand silently along the walls. Some have no eyebrows, forced to shave for elegance. Others wear bronze collars engraved with their master's name. Not for ornament, but so if they escape, whoever finds them knows where to return them. In this house, every slave is a living function. One is just for holding mirrors, one for polishing shoes. Some are called silentiari, assigned to keep silence in the room by sheer presence. There are children raised only to memorize their master's speeches in case he forgets. And there are grown men castrated to preserve their high voices and not make the noble women uncomfortable. They are not considered human, they are breathing furniture. The master, Gaius, enters in a white toga with golden trim held in perfect folds by two slaves walking behind him, constantly smoothing the fabric. He doesn't greet you with words. He just raises a glass, glances at you, then signals with a snap of his fingers. The feast hasn't begun, but the power play has. Luxury in Rome wasn't about enjoyment. It was about expression. Expressing that I am rich enough to assign a slave just to hold a fan. Expressing that I am powerful enough to inlay my name on the floor, so everyone must step on it to enter. It wasn't showing off, it was the language of status. Just like how Caesar once said, greatness must be built from the bowed eyes of others. And you, the average guest, begin to realize you didn't come here to eat. You came here to stay quiet, to watch, and to be the backdrop for someone else's spotlight. In this dazzling villa, you are part of the decor, nothing more, nothing less. And that is only the prelude. What's next? You'll see what happens when entertainment is defined by screams and a meal ends with a carefully choreographed death. But to get there first, you must learn how to swallow wine without asking what it's made of. You haven't even settled into your seat when you hear the wine being poured like a flood-swollen stream. Your glass, made from Egyptian glass, has never been empty for more than 2 minutes, but is also never filled more than 1/3 full. That's part of the ritual. Drink just enough to lose control, but never be drunk before the host. You're sitting in the triclinium, the main dining room, where 3 long couches are arranged in a U shape around a low table. The host always lies at the center of the main side, with honored guests on either side, and the less important ones pushed to the outer edges. No one sits. Everyone reclines propped on the left elbow, eating with the right hand. A posture both sensual and status declaring. Every position in this room has meaning. The one closest to the wine is trusted, the one lying near the door can be replaced at any moment. The table is a vivid painting of excess. But look closely, and you might begin to wonder, is this a meal or a contest to challenge the limits of the human stomach? Because what's placed on the table isn't chosen for taste, but for rarity, strangeness, and expense. Dishes like monkey brains, flamingo tongues, or unborn lamb fetuses are not served to fill the belly, but to signal status. I'm rich enough to eat what others wouldn't dare imagine. The more shocking the dish, the higher the rank. This is cuisine, as a symbol of class. In Rome, what couldn't be bought with money was brought to the banquet table and eaten. First comes the appetizer fava beans mixed with goose fat and garum, a fish sauce so valuable it could be used to bribe officials. Garum isn't just a seasoning, it's a statement. The common kind is for everyone, but imperial garum, fermented from anchovy guts in clay jars under the Italian sun for 3 months, is sealed in glass jars marked by a market inspector's stamp. The wealthy always bring their own bottle to feasts, like people today carry luxury perfume. Some guests even dab a few drops on their wrists as fragrance. Next comes baby pig stomach stuffed with raw duck eggs glazed with honey and black pepper. Everything is steaming fragrant, and no one touches a bite until the host nods. A whole roasted peacock is carried in not to be eaten, but to be admired. The feathers are preserved by spicing the internal cavity before roasting. Beside it, a suckling pig is slit open in the middle of the table, and from its steaming belly spill dozens of roasted quails, like a choreographed magic trick. This isn't cuisine, this is theatre. You turn to the person beside you trying to make small talk, but are met with only a solemn look. In some villas, silence is elevated to an artistic conspiracy. No commenting, no asking about the dish, and under no circumstance are you to ask, "What meat is this?" That question could shame the host, or make another guest vomit. Silence isn't politeness, it's the safeguard of the grandeur of the performance. The servers float in and out like ghosts. The only sounds are the slicing of bones and the slow gulping down of food. A Roman banquet doesn't need words because everyone is speaking through their eyes and what they dare to put in their mouths. A noble feast in Rome isn't for chatting. It's a social ritual. Who sits closest to the host has the most influence, who's served. First is the most favored. Who laughs too loudly is the one who doesn't know the rules. You bite into a rose-pickled egg, feeling warmth, sourness, the taste of pollen, and a hint of ash. Unclear if it came from the ingredients or the hand of the server passing it from the fire. There's a tap on a silver cup, a signal. A servant brings out a silver tray, holding a gourd of fresh blood, mixed with wine called Molsum. The brave will drink it. The grimacing will earn side glances. You understand this isn't a test of taste, but of honor. The feast continues with moray eel, a vicious fish raised in a private home pond. Its guts cleansed with goat milk. Then comes goose liver steeped in incense, followed by stuffed flamingo tongues with dried figs. A gentleman next to you jots down notes, not to cook it again, but to boast to friends that he once ate what others only hear about in legend. The air grows hotter not from fire, but because the dishes become social trials. You swallow the final course. A goat cheese ball rolled in ash, crisp and salty like the sweat from a collar. Then the host rises, all fall silent. The plates are cleared, the table wiped with perfumed towels soaked in rose water. The feast is over, but the real game is just beginning. Behind that curtain awaits a form of entertainment that humbles even the strongest stomach. The curtain at the end of the triclinium is pulled back. Cool Roman night air rushes in, carrying the sound of drums, flutes, and The sour smell of human sweat mixed with cheap wine. You haven't even digested the goat cheese when you're pulled into a strange ritual, humorous but chilling. A group of slaves is led into the courtyard. One wears a jester's costume, but his eyes are red and swollen as if he's been beaten. Another is smeared with honey, and a few small dogs are let loose to play with him. Laughter erupts, mixed with coughs and wine slurps. This isn't comedy. This is power dressed up as entertainment. What the Romans called fun was sometimes a sentence. Mime performances, short, wordless plays, were often performed by slaves. They had to parody scandals among the elite, mimic disgraced officials, or stage satirical sex scenes with a sneer. The audience would laugh, but the performers weren't allowed to slip up. One awkward move could be reason enough for public punishment on the spot. Laughter in this villa isn't relaxation, it's applause for obedience. One guest whispers to you, "Tonight there's a special act. The host brought a barbarian from the north." But first, as always, comes the appearance of the parasitus, the man who performs to earn a free meal. A skinny man enters wearing patched up clothes and a fake crown made of fig leaves. His job, to make people laugh, humiliate himself, and sometimes crawl under the tables to lick food crumbs. The crowd bursts into laughter when he meows like a cat or slaps himself in the face. The Romans call it merriment, but no one wishes to be born like that. Parasitus is a living proof of a Roman rule. To survive among power, you must know when to become a toy. You don't have time to react. The crowd has already started to cheer. But sometimes banquets turn into actual blood-stained theatre. Some villa owners are rich enough to have their own fighting pit. They buy young gladiators from training schools, have them train in the home yard, then host mini gladiator shows as the night's special event. Guests sip wine, chew meat, while down below, two boys bleed for real. Not a show, not fake. The host even signals, who fights beautifully gets rewarded, who falls poorly doesn't get their body retrieved. Even death must have aesthetic value in Rome. A young man with blonde hair, hands tied, is pushed into the center of the courtyard. No one explains, only the rising beat of music, and two guards standing with whips. He has to dance every pause, earns a lash. This is Roman amusement. He who suffers without crying is worthy of survival. Next comes the new dance, not by professionals, but by slaves forced to perform. Some girls have snakes painted on their skin with charcoal ink made to dance as if cursed. A man is painted gold from head to toe, made to stand like a living statue of liberty. No one speaks, but everyone watches. And anyone who doesn't watch is considered rude. The music stops. A servant brings out a metal cage. But before the monkey comes a reversal of the familiar order. A child with a dog mask is forced to crawl on all fours like a pet circling the table, while a monkey in a tiny toga sits on a high stool cracking nuts and sipping wine from a silver cup. Everyone bursts into laughter as the animal pretends to mimic human speech. The child, whose name no one remembers, is nudged in the ribs every time he slows down. In Rome, there are dinners where humans perform as animals, and animals are honored as guests. No one finds this absurd, because this society has inverted values in its blood. Inside the cage is a monkey shaved bald, its face painted like a clown. They give it wine, then release it onto the table. The game. See who dares to share a drink from the cup it dipped its hand into. Some giggle, some lean back laughing loudly, some say nothing. Because here, not laughing is also a form of protest. You begin to realize there is no boundary between entertainment and punishment. For the rich, every evening is a test of human limits. The so-called barbarian is brought out as plaything the powerless, forced to perform, and you, the one watching, are both a witness and an accomplice. As the night deepens and the wine starts tasting more like blood, you understand this is no longer a banquet. It is a long play, where laughter is the curtain hiding the groans, and Roman nights do not end in song, they end in silence stretching until morning. When all the noble guests had left the villa, when the wine had run dry, and when the laughter had faded, only then were they allowed to speak. Not to tell stories, but to clean up, gather leftover scrub floors. And remember, they, the slaves, were the only ones who saw everything and yet could never tell anything. Slaves in a Roman noble house weren't just labor. They were silent witnesses to power. They knew who had fallen drunk into the grape pile, who had cried when forced to watch torture, who quietly hid a letter under their napkin. They wiped spilled wine and overheard whispers not meant for common ears. They changed bedsheets and saw dried bloodstains of unclear origin. They lit candles and understood that kind of light didn't make a room any less cold without a single word. In Roman society, slaves were beings both present and erased. They might have names, but no status. They might learn to read, but never use that literacy to write the truth. Some were taught to read and do math to keep household accounts or recite poetry. But if they ever seemed too clever, they were often sold, because no master liked someone who saw through them, living under their roof. There were slaves assigned to keep daily journals, so the master would know what he had done the day before in his drunken stupor. But that journal bore no author's name. It was the voice of another, written by the hand of someone nameless. Some slaves were tasked with writing love letters on behalf of their masters, or composing poetry for young noble lovers. When the poem was recited at a banquet, all would applaud, while the one who wrote it stood behind the curtain holding a fan, not allowed to breathe too loudly. If a letter reconciled two rich families, the master received praise. But if the wording was poor, the ghostwriter slave was beaten, even if the fault lay in someone else's heart. You were the one who created the story, but never allowed to tell it. Some slaves were made to pretend to be familiar guests at parties, to create a warm atmosphere. They were called by affectionate nicknames, dressed in new clothes, but still beaten if they spilled wine. Some were placed among the dining guests as table companions for foreign visitors, to make the host seem wealthy and generous. These slaves were trained to know when to laugh, not to pour more wine or praise a guest's story. But the moment they made even a small mistake, they would be dragged away and beaten in front of everyone. They were talking furniture, and they knew fear. They lived among the language of the free, but not a single sentence belonged to them. Even when they loved, they weren't allowed to express it. Some young slaves fell in love, silently wrote messages in charcoal on the kitchen wall, then quickly erased them before cooking started. Some kept a button, a ribbon from their beloved, hidden in a crack in the stone wall. But their love was often discovered and exploited. Some slaves were forced to seduce noble guests, turned into living gifts. Some were made to fake a romance with another slave, to test loyalty or serve as entertainment. If they truly loved, they had to hide it or be separated forever. Some became confidants, keepers of secrets. The master told them everything, from affairs to political betrayals. Because slaves weren't allowed to testify, that very restriction made them the greatest holders of truth, and also the most tightly sealed vaults. Whoever spoke would be treated as a traitor even for telling the truth. As you leave the villa walking across the stone-tiled hallway, you hear faint sounds of cleaning bare feet on cold floors. An old slave looks up at you, his eyes not filled with hatred nor submission, just the gaze of someone who has outlived every banquet and still remains after everyone else has forgotten. He knows every secret in this house, but will never be allowed to speak. Not every empire falls because of war. Some collapse in moans. In Rome, desire wasn't hidden. It was fed by power. The higher one rose, the more rulers used sex not to love, but to prove they didn't need to love anyone at all. Passion as a weapon, and the palace as a stage. Have you ever heard of Nero marrying a male slave after castrating him and forcing him to call him wife? Or how Caligula once threw a banquet where the empress was laid out in the middle of the table for guests to admire the national treasure. That wasn't just perversion, it was a declaration of absolute power. He who controls another's body controls silence, cowardice, and ultimately obedience, ruling through the bed, and violence beneath the sheets. Domitian, one of the cruelest emperors, called himself Lord and God, and maintained a group of female slaves for nighttime service. No one dared refuse. One was caught crying after a night of serving, and the next morning her body was found in the garden lake. Royal passion was never voluntary. It was an order. And when that order came from a man in purple robes, every act was considered an honor, even when your skin was covered in bruises. And if someone resisted, the punishment was beyond imagination. An emperor once built a torture room in the palace basement, where sexual criminals were tied with leather straps hung upside down and interrogated not for information, but for pleasure. A young male slave who allegedly refused his master was stripped, smeared with honey, and tied to a pole in the garden to be eaten alive by ants. No trial, no evidence, just a whispered accusation and a slow death. In Rome, desire didn't just strip you of freedom, it could kill you. While the crowd still raised their cups to the emperor's nobility. Marriages as control, not companionship. Not just mistresses, but empresses too were tools. In many dynasties, the empress wasn't a partner, but a term in a power contract. She was chosen for lineage beauty and her ability to keep her mouth shut. Not loved, not chosen, and sometimes not even allowed to bear children unless instructed. Messalina, wife of Claudius, was famously accused of participating in a bizarre contest. Who could sleep with the most men in one night? Result: she won. But for that she was executed, because the emperor feared. She was becoming too famous. Agrippina, the mother of Nero, was rumored to have slept with her own son to maintain influence. True or not, no one knows. But it was written down as proof that in Rome shame mattered less than holding power. Many royal marriages were mere political alliances. Augustus's wife allegedly had to fake fainting every time he came to bed to avoid being summoned for a virginity check. Tiberius, the emperor who lived in seclusion on Capri, kept a team of angelic children called minnows trained to swim between his legs while bathing. No one dared ask what it was really for, and every time the emperor changed his taste, a child disappeared from the pool. Sex, not just desire, but a way to carve one's name into power. Some were forced to become lovers of the emperor, then promoted like a gift or exiled the next day if the emperor grew bored. Many Roman noble families saw offering their daughters or sons to the emperor as a path to promotion. Those who obeyed were granted land gold or positions in court. Those who refused could see their entire family charged with treason. There was one case where a high-ranking official brought his 13-year-old daughter to the palace saying, "She can sing, dance, and knows how to keep silent." That night, the girl didn't cry, but the next morning, her father was appointed governor of Hispania. Those who slept with the emperor might receive a house lamb or a goblet of poison. Those who refused might disappear, and their families would never find a grave. When desire is no longer lust, but a strategy of rule. The Lupercalia festival, when all of Rome turned into a collective bed. If the emperor used sex as a personal tool, the Romans turned it into a public ritual. Every February, the Lupercalia festival was held to purify and bless the coming season of fertility. But unlike any religious ceremony you know, here Roman youths ran naked through the city, wielding whips made from young goat hides, striking any woman they encountered. Women didn't dodge. They stood waiting, sleeves, raised backs exposed, believing those lashes would help them conceive more easily and suffer less in childbirth. In the villas, nobles held 3-day wine feasts where all boundaries between spouses, servants, and friends blurred. Some wore masks, some wore nothing, some came only to watch. On that day, Rome was no longer a capital. It was the bare flesh of power. The Roman palace once had no bedrooms, only night duty rooms. Those summoned weren't allowed to ask why. They only needed to know. If your name was called, you had to go. If not, someone else would. And the scariest thing wasn't who was summoned, but who had learned to enjoy it. The Roman Empire didn't fall in its final battle. It cracked piece by piece. Through every pillow, every hand left unheld, and every person turned into a toy in the hands of rulers. Not every throne is made of stone. Some are built from other people's bodies. In Roman villas, blood wasn't only shed on the battlefield. It appeared right in the middle of the banquet table, next to red wine and high-pitched laughter. Entertainment through dying and laughing at pain. Not every noble had their own stage, but the wealthiest often had a miniature arena in their homes. There, after feasting, they call out a few young slaves and demand they reenact the death of a hero, a criminal, or a beast. No acting. It had to be real. If it was a hero, that person would be given a dull sword. If it was a monster, they'd be dressed in animal fur and hunted down by noble children. The audience? People munching grapes, clapping, and occasionally placing bets on who would die first. Rome didn't wait for blood to spill in the arena. They poured it like wine, before the food even digested, when the arena became the banquet, and death the dessert. It wasn't just people dying by the blade. Animals were also staged to suffer among the appetizers. Some noble villas had courtyards specifically designed for on-site hunting games. They'd release leopards, tigers, even elephants, into thin wooden pens built in the garden. Guests would ride horses around the cage, holding spears, competing to see who could kill the beast fastest, to the sound of applause and overflowing wine. One man was recorded killing a leopard just as it roared, then returning to the table to finish his roasted chicken. No one asked why it had to be done. There was only one comment: quick hands. In Rome, animal blood was considered sauce and served right between courses. During the time of Titus and Domitian, some royal feasts ended with the back doors opening, where an impromptu arena was set up in the backyard. Once the emperor himself chose the fighters, a prisoner of war and a dwarf accused of petty theft. No one knew who won. They only knew the crowd clapped louder when more blood spilled. In another villa, the host built a transparent glass cage, placing inside a starving leopard and a defiant female slave. Guests were invited to enjoy dessert while watching. No one left. No one screamed. There was only chewing, the entertainers, and the unwilling victims. Not all who were killed were criminals. Sometimes dropping a wine glass was enough for a servant to become the new dish for the evening. One honored guest once requested the host to kill someone before him as a birthday gift. The host didn't hesitate. When life is reduced to its final seconds and wrapped in applause, Rome was no longer an empire but a circus, and blood was the ticket. Death was cheered, not feared. In the Colosseum, death matches were staged like epic plays. There were scripts, there were props, and there were real corpses. People came to celebrate, not to mourn. They bought laurel wreaths, pastries, and cheered like it was a football game. Some nobles even signed up to fight, not out of bravery but curiosity to feel fresh blood on their faces. A noblewoman named Faustina was recorded to have killed 3 slaves in a single day, then wrote in her diary, "The first blood smelled fishy, but the third, like roses." Naumachia, when oceans were built just for blood to spill, it wasn't just swordplay. The Romans organized naval battles right in the middle of dry land. Emperor Augustus had a massive artificial lake dug in Campus Martius. Later, Claudius followed with a famous naval battle on Lake Fucine. They built real ships, drafted prisoners from across the empire, divided them into teams, armed them with real weapons, and ordered them to fight to the death before tens of thousands of spectators. Sometimes it rained heavily and the water turned icy cold, but no one was allowed to stop. Survivors weren't spared. They were executed because the play had ended and no one wanted the actors stepping off stage. Spectators sat comfortably in their seats, eating grapes, sipping wine, and complaining that the acting wasn't dramatic enough. Rome may have had droughts, but blood, it never ran dry. When Rome lost feeling and made death its identity, cruelty was no longer a sin. It became the entertainment standard. The more emotionless you were, the more you were seen as truly noble. The more ruthless, the more parties you were invited to. And when a 6-year-old child cheered after seeing someone beheaded, Rome was no longer a place to live. It was only a place to die beautifully. Not every murderer wears rags. Not every tyrant shouts in the square. Some only need to sit on a throne and write a decree, a poem, or a joke to make thousands vanish. Welcome to the minds of those who destroy humanity with a smile. Caligula, the emperor who married a horse and killed out of boredom. When Caligula took the throne, the people of Rome sighed in relief, because his late father, Germanicus, had been a beloved military hero. They hoped his son would inherit that kindness. They were wrong. Caligula didn't just throw money into the arena, he threw human lives into his fickle whims. He married one of his horses, Incitatus, and intended to make it a consul. He made the Senate applaud every time the horse neighed, and if he was bored that day, he would pick someone at the banquet and order their death just to see what their face looked like when dying. Once he stood on a balcony looking down at the square and muttered, "I wish all Romans had just one neck, so I could strike it in one blow." He once ordered his soldiers to line up in the courtyard, then randomly chose one to execute, just for fun. Rome didn't have a mad king. Rome had a blood god with a laurel crown, Nero, when an artist was handed the power of life and death. If Caligula was a tantrum, Nero was destruction set to music. He loved the stage, loved poetry, and loved himself. Nero set fire to Rome, according to many accounts, to create the right backdrop for a tragedy he had written. As people burned alive, he sang the Sack of Ilium, about the burning of Troy. After the fire, he redrew the city map, and right on the land where homes once stood, he built the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a massive palace with an artificial lake, gilded ceilings, and a colossal statue of himself. The people pitched tents. He pitched a play. He executed his mother, his wife, and anyone who missed a beat. One night, he disguised himself as a slave to walk the streets, and had people killed if they didn't recognize him. The most beautiful crimes are the ones with music. Domitian, emperor of darkness and silence. Domitian didn't kill for fun. He killed to extinguish thought. He was a master of psychological terror. Instead of shouting, he sat in a closed room, read lists of potential traitors, and had people followed, kidnapped, tortured to death, even if they hadn't done anything. He made the entire palace afraid of whispering. Many said, "Domitian didn't kill you. He made you destroy yourself." And every time he smiled, it meant someone was being buried alive outside the city wall. He always carried a small notebook, called it a list, but in truth, it was a death ledger. Once a name was written in, it was never erased, only crossed out after death, and those who survived were the ones not yet written down. Commodus, when a fool has power and muscles, if you think only geniuses can ruin an empire, Commodus will make you think again. He believed he was Hercules reborn, wore lion skins, carried a club, and ordered statues of himself to be erected everywhere, even in temples of the gods. Commodus entered gladiator fights himself, and always won, because the opponents were forced to lose. In the arena, he demanded mirrors be placed all around, so he could admire every angle of himself holding a spear, stabbing, and killing. He didn't just want victory. He wanted the audience to gaze at him like a living statue, lit from all sides. He renamed the city of Rome after himself, Colonia Commodiana, and instead of ruling, he spent hours in the bath, making slaves shave his legs and tell jokes. Sometimes an empire doesn't die by the sword, but by stupidity, big enough, long enough, and unchallenged. A beautiful crown doesn't mean what's underneath isn't rotten. Roman history isn't short on glory, but beside every triumph, there was always a clean-shaven face dressed in purple and signing off on atrocities. You don't need a sword to kill a civilization. You just need the wrong person wearing the crown. And when the people cheer, not for victory, but for surviving a quiet day, that's no longer an empire. That's a stage for organized madness. No one questions a civilization that knows how to write poetry. No one doubts an empire that can build lecture halls, arenas, and public baths. And no one calls someone in a white toga reading Stoic philosophy evil. But that was exactly what Rome did best, wrapping rot in beauty. When art is used to forget the corpses, Roman poetry was brilliant. Virgil, Ovid, Horace. They wrote verses that softened the heart. But when you look up from the book, what do you see? A slave being crucified by the market gate, while the public read love poems behind the theatre. Criminals were beheaded to create a realistic atmosphere. Art doesn't erase blood, it only gives it rhythm. Law doesn't protect justice, it protects the order of the powerful. Roman law was detailed. There were sections on property, marriage, inheritance, but most were written to keep the powerful in place and lock down the voiceless. If a slave was killed by their master, there was no trial, as if they were a person. If a woman was raped, she needed male witnesses to be protected. And when an emperor issued a new law, it wasn't out of morality. It was to redefine what was right in favor of the throne. In Rome, law didn't forbid evil. It just picked a side for it. Philosophy, a thin veil for cold-bloodedness. You can quote Seneca to teach patience. But did you know? He once wrote a letter praising Nero after Nero had his mother killed. Roman philosophers lived close to power, very close. And sometimes they were silent at just the right moments. Philosophy doesn't always resist. Sometimes it's the tablecloth for a cannibal feast. And when evil speaks calmly, uses pretty words, and knows how to quote philosophy, it becomes invincible. Roman coins, artful power. If you've ever held an ancient denarius, you'll see beautiful images. An emperor on horseback holding a laurel branch, or the goddess Justice blindfolded holding scales. That coin was minted to travel across the empire, even to places where people had never seen the emperor's face, and they believed the one who made the coin must be a wise and gentle father. But the truth, behind the thin layer of silver, was blood. Blood of the slaves in the mines, blood of the taxed until collapse. The emperor didn't need to persuade with words. He only needed his face to be printed well, enough for every hand to hold. Coins don't lie. They just speak from the other side. When evil knows how to dress, well speak softly and quote poetry. Who dares question it? Rome didn't fall because it lacked culture. It fell because it was too good at using culture to cover the sinkhole beneath its feet. When evil plays the lyre carved statues and declares that all men are born with reason, but hangs a slave upside down just for asking directions out of the city, the problem isn't barbarism. It's the kind of civilization that puts lipstick on a corpse. Any empire that drapes velvet over prisons will rot from the inside. When people talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, they mention barbarians, invasions, and broken frontier walls. But the truth is, Rome fell from within, piece by piece, day by day in silence. There was no trumpet sounding, only the slow fall of bricks deep within an empire that believed itself eternal. At first, Roman soldiers swore loyalty to the Republic, to ideals, but over time they became loyal only to the general who paid them the most. The army became a personal tool. Generals took turns marching into Rome to seize power. Civil war wasn't a disaster anymore. It was a strategy. An empire begins to rot when the sword no longer protects but bargains. To buy loyalty, emperors started printing more money, but the silver in the denarius kept thinning until only a coating remained. Inflation rose, food became scarce, but the court still held festivals. When money loses value, promises lose meaning. While the palace echoed with music outside, scholars, sages and doctors quietly left. Some were killed for speaking truth. Others chose silence or secrecy. When society no longer rewards the rational, it only makes room for those with disguises. The empire still shone, but it was a light no one wanted to stand under. To fix the chaos, emperors imposed increasingly strange laws. You can't change jobs if your father did that job. You can't leave your village. You can't raise prices even if food cost tripled. And then no one believed in fairness anymore, only in luck. When law is written to tie people down, not to guide, the shackle has replaced the staff. When philosophy fell silent, when forums no longer echoed with speeches, the church became the loudest voice. What began as faith Christianity became a tool of rule. And when faith is controlled by the throne, salvation becomes a decree. Spirituality was turned into bureaucracy. Hope came with an imperial seal. The frontier walls still stood. The arenas were still crowded. The statues of gods were still polished weekly. But when a border soldier turned his head and saw no one listening inside, when a farmer looked at rotting grain in storage but still had to pay taxes, Rome had already fallen. No trumpet, no enemy army, just enough people pretending everything was fine.